2016, I made a trip down to my father's old cabin. It was 6 hours away in the woods outside of the hometown he grew up in, which was no longer even a town. Just an abandoned row of old buildings and stores along a deserted road. We'd never really go to his cabin, because he said there wasn't much of a reason to, once the town was gone. But after he passed away, I figured it'd be nice to take a trip down there to visit the home he once built. I knew it'd be in real bad shape, and I wanted to do some restorations on it as best I could, just to keep it standing and preserve it for as long as possible. If anything, I hoped the trip would clear my mind a little and give me some peace and quiet. I drove there, arriving at the town and parking my car behind one of the abandoned gas station buildings, then walked on the thin, rugged, winding trail 2 miles up to the cabin. I had all my backpacking gear, and brought along the tools I'd need for the job. There was a part of me that knew it might have toppled already, so I was prepared to camp the night in a tent if I had to. Luckily, after making the long trek through the woods though, I found the cabin still standing. It was in a small clearing in the trees, just a basic rectangular log cabin with vines and greenery growing up the outer walls. When I walked in, I noticed there were no locks on the door, and found the interior to be in pretty awful shape. Trash scattered everywhere, and a musty, unpleasant smell filling the room. It was clear that at some point someone realized this place wasn't in use, and probably had stayed here, maybe for a while, although it seemed it wasn't recent. No signs of anything being there for a couple years or so. I moved what I could into the corner of the room, making a flat space to put my stuff, and with the sun already setting, I unrolled my sleeping bag and just settled in. I should mention, although I didn't hear or see anything that night, I couldn't sleep for any longer than 30 minutes at a time before waking up with a strange, disturbing feeling. It made for a really bad night. I got up at sunrise, groggy and wondering if this whole trip was a mistake. I used my little camping stove to brew up a coffee, then took a walk through the woods to clear my head. It was still kind of dark, the sun only barely peeking out through the trees. A little ways in, I found an overlook, sort of a hill where I could see above the tree line. Thought it'd be a great place to watch the sunrise, but I found something else. I could see the abandoned town from up there. It was very far away, but there was a light. Looked like it was from a window in one of the buildings. I couldn't tell from that distance if it was from a house or a store, and it turned off suddenly a minute later. It made me worry a bit about my car, but mostly I was just surprised anyone else was around here. Likely, it was just some urban explorers checking out the town, and nothing to worry about, although it was a really big coincidence. I sat on the hill for an hour watching the sun come up, then walked back through the woods to start working on the cabin. First thing was to reseal and clean up the outside. I will say though, the whole time I was out there working, I kept getting that feeling, the one I had during the night. Every time I looked back at the woods, this eerie sense loomed over me. It took me a bit to really understand what it was that I felt, but eventually I managed to grasp what I think it was. I felt like I wasn't alone. I kept working, but constantly looked over my shoulder. The possibility of anyone else being out here was genuinely impossible. The abandoned town, sure, but here, some random woods with nothing but a decaying cabin. I thought I must have been on edge for reasons that were beyond me. Once the sun was going down, I headed inside, testing out the old wood stove. These things seemed to be undying, as it fired up no problem and warmed up the cabin. I sat near it and just watched the flames, listening to it crackle as I thought about everything. My dad, this trip, just life in general. But sometime later in the night, the crackles in the flame were suddenly accompanied by a similar sound. Cracks and crunching coming from the front of the cabin. I turned my head and listened. I only managed to realize it wasn't a wild animal, and was definitely a person, just as they got up to the front door. The wood stove suddenly felt like it was 1,000 times louder, preventing me from intently listening to whoever the hell was outside the cabin. Then they knocked, and called out a name that made my whole world stop for a moment. The man called out my dad's name. It felt like it just took hold of me, making me stand up and walk up to the other side of the door, in complete shock. How did he know my dad? I couldn't resist calling out and asking who he was. The man outside hesitated. I think he knew after I spoke that I wasn't my dad. I'm an old friend of the man who built this cabin. Was hoping I'd get to see him again. The unknown man spoke. I got a little closer to the door, the urge to open it and have someone to talk to about my dad, to hear stories and everything. But still, something kept me from opening it. Why was he even here? I asked, and the man said he lived in that old town. After thinking for a second, I decided to share that I was the son of the man he was looking for, my dad, and he had passed away. The man behind the door paused. I'm real sorry to hear that, kid. Wish I could have seen him one more time. Initially, it felt nice to hear that, but I quickly sensed something was off about the way he said it. Something in his voice. It wasn't the sadness I was expecting from someone who just found out they lost a friend. Before I could say anything, and almost like he knew I was thinking too hard about it, the man continued talking. Why don't you open up and we can have a chat? It's real cold out here, son. Would be nice to share that fire. Although he talked very slowly, I sensed an urgency or a lack of patience in his voice. Something in me felt he wasn't being truthful, that maybe he wasn't who he said he was. Sure, he knew my dad's name and was in the town he used to live in, but how did I know he was really a friend of his? Still, as I was thinking, I couldn't find what words to say next, and in my pause, the man asked again for me to open up. He knocked on the door again, a little harsher. His voice grew less kind and more demanding. I took a few steps from the door, backing away. Kid, open the door. You gonna let me die out here in the cold? That what your father would want from you. My heart began pounding as I dug into my backpack for my hunting knife. The man continued hitting the door and yelling subtle threats, discarding the fake identity of being a kind, harmless friend. This went on for much longer than I could keep track of. It felt like it never ended, some continuous nightmare. But suddenly, the man punched the door in anger, and it was followed by the sound of his footsteps walking away, going back into the woods. I stayed up all night, mind racing as I waited in fear. But when the sun came up, and with no signs of him around, I hurriedly packed my bag and ran from the cabin. I got really lucky, finding my car untouched, still well hidden behind the crumbling gas station. I fled from the town and drove non-stop back home. I was hoping with that trip I'd get some answers, or come to terms with everything, but honestly, I'm just left with more questions. I realized I never even really knew why my dad moved away from there. I guess I assumed it was because the town was dying off and everyone else was leaving, but now I think there was probably more to it, and maybe there were other reasons that he'd never brought me back to his cabin. I don't know why that man was still around there, or what he really wanted from me, or how he even knew my dad at all. But something tells me he didn't have any good intentions that night. Had I let my emotions get the better of me and opened the door to invite him in, I genuinely don't think I ever would have made it out of that town.